Hi everyone, thank you very much for joining us today for this Foothold webinar on a really timely subject. It's around anxiety and the new normal. Now, some of you may already know that Foothold has a 130-year-long history of supporting engineers and their families. You can see some of the ways we support people on the next slide. Now, because we want to support as many people as we possibly can, our focus now is to offer more digital support, so you can access that from any corner of the world. And this webinar is really a part of that effort. So I'll go through a bit of housekeeping and then we can get started. Today's presentation will be around 40 minutes with time for your questions at the end. So please post your questions in the questions box as we go along. If there are questions we don't have time for in the end, please don't worry about that. We will be sending around all of the questions and answers to you after the webinar. So this session will also be recorded, so you will be able to have access to the slides and all the really useful information after the webinar. So also don't forget to check out the handout section, where there will be a link to our free Wellbeing Hub, which is full of clinically approved wellbeing resources, and that's really timely for this week, since it's, I'm sure many of you know, it's Mental Health Awareness Week this week. So for now, I am really excited to introduce you to Andy Thornton. Andy is a fully qualified cognitive behavioural hypnotherapist. He has over 10 years of experience in coaching, mentoring and supporting people. So we are really grateful to have him here today to talk about anxiety and how we're feeling about this thing we call the new normal. Now, if you already live with anxiety, or you just feel a bit uneasy about the world opening up again and navigating all of that, today Andy will be able to give you some information and insight on why that's happening, and also some really good tips and techniques that you can use to feel more confident about things. So without any further ado, I will hand you over to Andy. Thank you for being here, Andy.
All right, thanks, Aranta. That's great. And hello, everybody who's there. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak on this kind of short webinar on anxiety and the new normal. And I hope you find it interesting, hope you find it helpful. As Aranta said, if we go through, submit any questions that might crop up, and we'll either answer them at the end or subsequently. So as Aranta said, I'm a qualified cognitive behavioural hypnotherapist. That means that's a fusion really of cognitive behavioural therapy and hypnotherapy. And I've worked one-to-one with people over many years in a coaching, mentoring, therapeutic manner. And as a therapist, I've worked with hundreds of people now, dealing with issues kind of ranging from bereavement, workplace conflicts, anxiety, stress, phobias, and so on. And of course, over the last year, particularly over the last year, I worked a lot with frontline health professionals and people dealing with anxiety related to COVID-19. I've got a lot of experience in this area, but I'm still learning. We're all unique. We all have unique circumstances, unique experiences, and there isn't a single therapeutic approach that is just going to be used for every single issue that arises. One thing that I do find is the more I can help people to understand what's actually going on and what might be behind the suffering they're experiencing, then the easier it is for them to find a way forward. And I hope that today we can give at least a little bit of that insight. So we're going to look at four things really. We're going to look at the influence of the last 14 months. Clearly that's a major player. I'm going to talk a little bit about what anxiety is, what gives rise to the distress that we sometimes feel in life, and then think about how can we really begin to examine and understand what lies at the heart of any suffering and difficulty that we're experiencing. And then at the end, we'll have a look at a range of strategies that we can use to make life better and make life easier for us. So let's just reflect for a few minutes. You know, as we recover from the pandemic and people begin to emerge from lockdown, and particularly Monday is a big date for many people, it's likely that there's going to be, whatever happens, an extended period of recovery. You know, society, communities, organizations, and individuals will inevitably need to work through. And if we look at the timeline of what's happened, we can see that in March of last year, you know, we were all thrust into a new world. Things moved pretty quickly. We went into effectively crisis management mode. Around June time, we had glimmers of hope, and we had a brief reopening in summer of last year before we hit the second lockdown in November. Slightly more optimistic view in December with the start of the vaccine rollout before the third lockdown in January, which really went right the way through until March with the starting of the reopening of schools. And now here we are, April, May, and we finally got some more concrete signs of hope emerging. And interestingly, you know, in that time, of course, we've gone from initial surprise and shock, probably, about the huge changes to life that we've all experienced. And then we've kind of got used to it. You know, we've been living under the shadow of the pandemic for over a year, and people are nothing if not adaptable. So we're already living a kind of new normal, and we have been doing that for quite a long time. So now we find ourselves, as we start to reopen, confronting another major time of change, a change back to how life was, or at least some semblance of how life was before the pandemic. So we're all going to have to work through some form of change over the coming weeks and months. And that's something that some people are going to deal with relatively easily, and others are going to find that extremely difficult to do. Now, clearly, everybody will have experienced the pandemic in their own unique way. You know, some will have been more directly impacted than others, but everybody has been touched by what's happened. And, you know, their future thinking, attitudes, behavior will be shaped to some degree by this experience. And of course, throughout the whole period, you know, life has been continuing for people, and life has its usual day-to-day challenges, stresses, anxieties that we might normally expect. What the pandemic has added into the mix has been a real flood of uncertainty, and I think that for some people has eroded the foundations of their safety, their security, their sense of place in the world and in society, and things that were very much taken for granted were pretty well ripped away from us. And the true unpredictability of life has effectively been laid bare for us. And in the midst of the crisis, many, perhaps most people have been getting through. You know, we're coping. We get charged by adrenaline. We have a natural instinctive response to survive. So in this time, we've been drawing on reserves of energy, reserves of resilience, emotional stamina, but often without the usual ability we would have had to restore those reserves as we go, which we would have done previously through, you know, socializing, connecting with other people, hobbies and activities that we might have enjoyed, which we haven't been able to do. So the result as we emerge into the light of whatever our new normal is likely to be numbers of people who start to experience the impacts of this depletion of reserves, a bit like when you've worked really, really hard and you go on holiday, and then first thing you do is your body goes, wow, I'm on holiday. And so often people go down with illnesses at that point. So people are going to feel that depletion of reserves, and people are going to have the opportunity to reflect on their experiences and perhaps realize how difficult this last year has been. And at the same time, many organizations are going to be under pressure to accelerate recovery, to recover business, to recover income, to recover service delivery, to recover customers, clients, or if you're in the health sector, to recover patients and get back to what would have been business as usual. And also for many organizations and for people working in organizations, there are decisions to be made about how things are going to work going forward. After a year or more in which people have worked remotely, will there be a return to traditional ways of working? You know, if so, when and how is that going to happen? And if not, then what new processes, what technologies, what infrastructure, what support needs to be put in place to make this the way we now work? So, you know, as we emerge, our leaders, managers, employees, all of us are going to be faced with a kind of three-pronged dilemma of implementing perhaps large-scale organizational change, acceleration of business recovery, and then supporting people, supporting ourselves, supporting other people in our need for recovery, recharge, reflection, and the ability to process our individual experiences. I think there are going to be some general challenges that we all face in some form. You know, we can see there is an element of ongoing uncertainty. You know, certainly at the moment, nothing is yet certain. As I mentioned, there's going to be a pressure to return to business as usual, and there is going to be some remodeling of organizations. And then at a very personal level, you know, there's just the fatigue of everything we've been dealing with, that depletion of reserves. There's the need for recovery time at a time when those organizations that are trying to get back up to speed might be under a lot of pressure to start delivering. And underpinning all of that is just an undercurrent of emotional distress, which people are experiencing at different levels as a result of what we've all been through. So against that backdrop, it's not surprising that people are likely to feel some level of anxiety as we move into our new world. So in a moment, I'm going to outline a framework through which you can explore for yourself and maybe help others to explore those things that are causing difficulty, causing distress. But I just want first to take a moment to consider anxiety. It's a word we use very readily, perhaps more than ever at the moment, but actually, you know, what is it? What is it we're talking about? Well, I think the first thing to say is that anxiety is normal. It isn't something we shouldn't have. It's, you know, if we experience it, there's nothing wrong with us in that sense. It's not abnormal, it's not wrong. And in fact, the degree of anxiety can be helpful to us. It can spur us on to behave in particular ways. It can mean we care about what we do and about doing things well. And of course, in some situations, it can be the trigger we need for us to be careful, to keep us safe. So we don't want to eliminate anxiety, which I think is a common misconception. It's something I find in the people who come to me. Very often I find they are seeing anxiety as something that is very clear cut. They're either anxious or they're not. It's either on or off. Well, this isn't the case at all. It's actually better to think of anxiety as operating across a spectrum, you know, a scale, which at one end has no anxiety at all, and at the other, our anxiety is completely overwhelming and intolerable. And we don't really want to operate either ends of that spectrum. For most of us, lower levels of anxiety can be useful. So we mostly want to think about turning our anxiety down rather than turning it off. And the other thing to bear in mind, and which is useful, is this idea that anxiety is future-based. Unlike depression, which tends to be past-based, anxiety comes from an anticipation of a future event or events, something that has not yet occurred. So therefore, it's not real. So we get feelings that are very real. Our experiences of anxiety are real, but the thing we're anxious about is not real because it hasn't yet happened. And what happens when we have thoughts that are about something that might happen in the future, and typically that they're likely to be more negative than positive, is that we trigger a threat response in the brain. We trigger an alert that something's wrong, that we're at risk. And that involves the release of the stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol are involved, and the body prepares for trouble. So we experienced physiological changes. We might get increased heart rate, shallower, more rapid breathing, and so on. And those changes and feelings can be pretty subtle, or they can be very extreme. They can lead to panic attacks and a general inability to function, so very damaging indeed. So anxiety, while normal, can have serious impacts on our lives. Now, the good news is that for most people, it's possible to learn to manage that anxiety and to keep it at levels that are not damaging or restrictive to life. And building our understanding of what we're going through and finding ways to alleviate our suffering requires us to work through a number of steps that we can think of as making up a support process. And it has these 6 steps in. We need to identify the component parts of our distress, what's actually making it up. Because very often there's more than one thing involved. And we need to identify this so that we can address the actual issues. And having identified those, it's important that we validate that what we're dealing with or what somebody else is doing is real. It's real for us, it will be real for somebody else. There can be a temptation to deny issues that we're experiencing, or to think that they're stupid or unnecessary, people are weak. Very common in the language of people who come to speak to me. And we have to accept that it's okay to not be okay, to use that perhaps overused phrase, and that what we're dealing with is genuine and it's worth our attention. We then need to calibrate our experience so that we see it in its true context. And I'm going to talk a bit more about calibration later on. But the focus throughout all of this is actually on this underlying word exploration. And we're exploring so that we can better understand for ourselves and maybe help other people to explore what our experiences have been, what impact they're having on day-to-day life. And what I'll take you through is a way of thinking about our issues and a guide for those areas of exploration. And the act of exploring in this way helps to normalize the experiences, make them part of life, because that's what they are, and lead to a deeper understanding about the ways we can reduce and hopefully then eliminate any traumatic impacts that we experience. And through working with people during the pandemic and from a wider experience of working with people over many years, it's been possible to identify a number of fairly consistent issues that arise, and I'm going to refer them here as the components of distress. And I'm going to talk you through them, and what I'm going to present is not exhaustive by any means, but actually these are significant components of distress that can accumulate, that can create really powerfully negative impacts on life. People are like to experience one or more of the components throughout their life in different ways and at different levels of extremity. And it's also, of course, highly likely that one or more component will be experienced at any time, producing an accumulating effect and potentially increasing the traumatic impact of that person's experience of life. Now, at its simplest, any exploration of active components will just reveal normal life with natural ups and downs, positive moments alongside moments of discomfort that are probably more essential for a balanced life than they are harmful. However, in its more complex manifestation, the life impact of even a single component can result in really extreme trauma and potential long-term negative effects. And sometimes that's going to need professional help to overcome. And the aim of describing the components that I'll go through is to provide a way in which you can explore and understand your own experiences and enable you to help others perhaps who may be finding life difficult. Now, of course, it might be that some of the issues that emerge will be sufficiently challenged. They want referral or warrant referral to more specialized support, and you should always seek professional help if you feel unable to cope alone. You know, just in the same way that you would go to the doctor if you felt extremely unwell. Well, the focus of what we're going through here is really built around entering this post-COVID world and post-COVID recovery. There are always going to be aspects of life and work that give rise to distress or trauma for us. And sometimes we experience events in our personal lives that are particularly difficult to deal with, they're traumatic. Organisations are continually implementing uncomfortable changes. And of course, you know, there's always the concern that at some point we're going to face another issue like COVID, and you know, there will be another big issue that we have to face as a society. So in recognising this, what we've done is broken out the components into three principal headings. So personal, work and job, and pandemic. And if we look at the personal components first, you know, four things come up here. Firstly, we have the limit of resilience. You know, we all have the ability to cope at a certain level of stress and anxiety. It's completely normal, perhaps necessary for us to experience stress. And at the same time, we all have a point at which we can't cope anymore. It's not uncommon, I find, for people to think about an overload of stress coming about because of one major event, but actually it's usually, in my experience, not like that. For most people, issues arise through an accumulation of stresses that happens over time and that build up, and they get heavier and heavier until they can't be carried any longer. Then we're all different, so naturally we have different points at which we reach that breaking point when we just can't carry on anymore. And similarly, different people will have different triggers, so that what one person finds pretty straightforward to deal with could be the straw that breaks the back of somebody else. Secondly, we've got general health concerns, and from time to time, it's not uncommon to experience general health concerns, you know, either directly for ourselves or related to somebody close to us. And most of the times, those concerns are going to be low level, they don't cause any great distress, but they can become significant and maybe now particularly magnified through the lens of the pandemic. And that's perhaps heightened our sense of vulnerability in this area. Thirdly, we've got significant traumatic event. You know, unfortunately, some people experience significant trauma in their lives. Sometimes those events might have taken place a very long time ago, but they're still impacting on the quality of life. In other cases, trauma might be quite recent and vivid. And I know, you know, from the work I've done, there are people who over the last 14 months have been through particularly traumatic experiences. Whatever the origin, severe trauma can have a really profound effect on people that can last for many years and can require quite a lot of specialist help to overcome. And then the fourth one here is moral injury. So there are times in life when we may be asked or we might be required to do something that doesn't actually fit with our personal, ethical or moral views. You know, such times can be pretty difficult, and they can result in people being faced with really difficult choices. And that's particularly true where those choices pertain to job and the need to keep a job, which means working in ways that require an ethical or a moral compromise to be made. And I've worked with a few people in that space. And in those situations, people can find themselves in a bit of a lose-lose position. It's likely to give rise to feelings of people being trapped, frustrated, anger, and possibly animosity to people around them. If we look at the next category, the work and the job, again, four things here. The top two are related to job and finances. So job or financial threat, job security is an important thing for most people. It always has been. And anything that appears to threaten it can give rise to high levels of stress and anxiety. Now, of course, it's true that no job can ever be absolutely secure, but the pandemic, I think, has created a climate which is highly uncertain for many people. And some jobs, you know, people working around healthcare have probably been in areas that are really very secure or would seem to be secure, but even there, actually it's possible they have family members, friends, people they know who are facing considerable uncertainty, and that can also give rise to stress and anxiety. And then, of course, there are people who have been directly impacted, and sadly, one impact of the pandemic has been the loss of jobs or income for many people, and a highly uncertain future as well. And, you know, again, while people around us might not have been personally directly impacted, they may know others, and it's possible that there are partners or family members who have been affected. So people could be living with, you know, a loss of income, household income, that is having a significant effect on life and making life quite difficult to deal with. Thirdly, here we've got work changes. Organisations are always changing, you know, and change means disruption to what is known. And while the outcomes of that change can often be beneficial, most people experience some discomfort at thought of change, and as the change process runs its course. The combination of lockdowns, working from home, redeployment for some people into different roles, and a general changes in the way people work are likely to have created quite a big shockwave of change that some people will find really difficult. And we add into that the potential uncertainty about how people will be working in a post-pandemic world, and that could result in a significant increase in anxiety and discomfort. And then lastly, that word again, uncertainty. I think one thing the pandemic has highlighted really vividly for us is how uncertain the future really is. You know, while uncertainty has always been and will always be a fact of life, we've lived as though we were able to predict the future with great confidence. And that confidence has been shown to have been really misplaced. And many people now find that lack of perceived certainty about the future to be very uncomfortable. And as we emerge from life under a pandemic, as hopefully we're going to do, it's possible that many people will find thoughts of the future, of planning for future events, considerably more stressful than might have been the case beforehand. And underpinning these is the pandemic itself. And you know, the components here, we would expect over time these components to fade away and to disappear. But the chances are that some other major aspect will appear, so new components will arise. In the pandemic space, clearly we've got lockdown in March 2020. The world changed. We didn't know at that time that over a year on we'd still be living under some kind of restriction. And you know, some have been really seriously impacted by lockdown, some have found it easier, but everybody's been impacted in some way. And you know, the impacts of that have the potential to extend well beyond the easing of restrictions on daily life. And of course, allied closely to lockdown is working from home. And at the start of lockdown, many people found themselves very unexpectedly working from home, and jobs that would have been not have been considered suitable for home working suddenly turned out to be quite manageable. And you know, managers I know who would have been skeptical about home working have been shown that it can actually be really effective. And for many people, not having to travel to work every day was initially at least kind of pleasant novelty. It opened up a possibility of more personal freedom, more home and family time, perhaps a better work-life balance. But over the months, some of that novelty's worn off, and some of the downsides have become more apparent. Not everybody has a good home working environment. They don't necessarily have suitable connectivity to make things easy. And working alone without ready access to others who can answer questions, give simple support, has actually proved difficult for some. And it's also important, isn't it, to acknowledge that, you know, human beings are social creatures, and much of our social connection we get through our time at work. At the same time, there will undoubtedly be those for whom home working remains an ideal, and who will be really reluctant to go back to normal ways of working. So sustained home working will be a considerable source of stress for some, while for others the idea of going back to a daily commute, working in an office or some other organisational setting will be equally unpleasant and stressful. Next, along and close to these is the idea of isolation. 12 months of lockdowns and restrictions on normal life have impacted everyone in some way or another, but can have been particularly difficult for those people who have experienced long periods of isolation and you know, perhaps with little respite available, not being able to be with other people, to share thoughts, feelings, to get the normal reassurance that many of us take for granted and have been able to take for granted, and to experience that over a very long period of time can be particularly difficult to deal with. And dealing with stress and traumatic experiences in a situation of isolation is interestingly one of the triggers for PTSD. Then we get COVID risk. You know, we've all lived with COVID around us. You know, we all have to think about it and the impact on life. It doesn't matter how relaxed you've been about the virus. It's not been possible to remain completely impassive about the potential risks of going out, being around other people and what that might mean. And that awareness of risk has been a constant companion. And even as we begin to emerge from the pandemic, it's likely that that's going to stick around at some level for many months to come. And then we've got observed COVID. Many people have seen the impact of COVID firsthand, either because close family or friends have contracted it, or as a result of maybe working on the front line in healthcare. And while many people might experience the virus relatively mildly, of course, other people have been extremely ill. Many people, as we know, have died. And there are many others who are actually still struggling with the ongoing effects of long COVID. So being so close to the direct impacts of this virus adds another layer of discomfort and distress that we've had to deal with. And then, of course, unfortunately and sadly, some people have directly experienced COVID. They've contracted the virus and they've experienced the illness. And, you know, that might have been fairly mild, or it could have been making them extremely ill as a result. And it's possible that those experiences that people have had will lead to an increase in a sense of vulnerability, you know, and a corresponding decrease in feelings of safety and security that are really important to us. And then finally here we've got a desire for something different. And in a response to the onset of the pandemic, you know, lots of people have been working differently. They might have been doing different things. They might have been in different jobs. They've certainly been in a different environment. And actually that's got a potential to be a catalyzing moment where people have started to think about, you know, what do they want from life? Do they want something different? Do they want to go back to the old job, the old way of working? Actually, you know, is this triggering now a desire for life to be different than it was before? And that wouldn't be unusual or unexpected, but that can give rise to feelings of dissatisfaction. And that can lead to considerable distress, feelings of being trapped, and that can be very difficult for people to deal with. Now, we can think of life as being a little bit like a flower. And it has a stem, it has leaves, it has petals that grow and bloom. And as we go through life, we accumulate experiences, and these experiences can form the petals of our flower, and it can look beautiful from the outside. And yet those petals can also include the accumulation of one or more of the components of distress. You know, they're attached to our lives, and they can build up so that although things may look wonderful from the outside, our lives can actually be badly impacted by such accumulation. So that actually the flower isn't really healthy and vibrant, even though to other people it might appear to be fine. So what we're looking to do is to try and return ourselves to health. So as we come to realize that we have gathered up these various components, and we can start to think and look at how they are impacting on our lives. And we can also see that it's unlikely that we're going to find one single thing that will immediately strip our flower of all of the unhealthy petals, all of those things that are affecting our lives, be they work changes, limits of resilience, moral injury, or one of the other components. So rather, we need to build our understanding of what those things are and how each one of them is affecting us, the extent to which it's impacting on our lives, and then we work on that issue directly. So in this way, we can, one by one, peel away those infected petals. We can let them fall away, and we can reveal the next issue that we need to deal with, until eventually there are no infected petals left. And we're able to see the green shoots of recovery. We can then build ourselves back up from a strong and healthy stem. So having explored the various components and the things that might be causing us distress, the next thing is important to consider the impact that those things are having and the way we're experiencing life. And those we can look at under a number of criteria. So we're going to evaluate against a number of criteria. And while any evaluation is naturally subjective because it comes from our own experience, the experience of the individual, if we were supporting somebody else from their experience, actually the process of exploring, of understanding, and then calibrating the impacts can actually be extremely valuable. And in itself, it's a therapeutic exercise. And these 6 impact areas that we can think about, we've got personal impacts. So they might be physical, they might be emotional, or they might be both. And so physical impacts are things that they directly relate to the way we feel physically. So our evaluation here might be the direct impact on physical health, whether real, or might just emanate in a loss of energy or difficulty sleeping. Emotional impacts are really concerned with the impact of any of the components on our emotional well-being. So that might give rise to generally low mood, low motivational, an unusual emotional response to normal life events. Relationship impacts are to do with the impact of components on any of our interpersonal relationships, friends, family, colleagues, associates. And the value here is the extent to which those relationships are changed or impacted as a result of one or more of the components. Behavioural impacts are the ways in which we've changed the way we behave because of what we've experienced. Some of those behaviour changes might be really clear, might be people not socialising, not going out, or they might actually be quite subtle and need a little more probing to understand. Family and friends impacts is connected to the way that family and friends may be struggling or suffering or experiencing distress, and the impact on our lives of being close to that and observing it. So once we're aware of other people's difficulties, that can have an impact on our lives. Anticipatory impacts are to do really with 2 potential areas. One is the anticipation of going out. What happens if I go out? When I go out back into the world, reconnect, start working in a normal way, again, what's going to happen? Some people are going to find re-engaging very easy, but many people I'm speaking to actually are finding that quite unsettling and giving rise to a lot of anxiety. And the other side of that is, what if it happens again? That anticipation of perhaps another major event with its effect on life. And then lastly, we've got the moral and ethical question. So, the extent to which people are being put in a position where they have to act in a way that runs counter to those moral or ethical beliefs, and what impact that has on work and on life in general. And it might be the impact might be a desire to find another job. It might be a loss of motivation. It might be a loss of that sense of connectedness to what they're doing, or an estrangement from people around them. So as I mentioned earlier, calibration of our experience and our discomfort is a particularly helpful strategy, and it's one that's very easily applied. So typically when I work with people, they see distress, anxiety in really clear-cut terms. As I said, they're either anxious or they're not, but of course their actual experience is much more nuanced. Our experience of the components of distress and where they impact on life is much more nuanced than that. So making a point of calibrating your feelings enables you to evaluate more objectively whether the level of anxiety you're feeling is increasing, whether it's decreasing, whether it's stable, and whether actually it's at a level that's manageable. And what I've found is that simply asking people to do that, use a simple subjective 0 to 10 scale, where 0 is there is no anxiety and 10 is it's unmanageable, can have immediately positive impacts. Additionally, the act of calibration does two things cognitively. Firstly, it involves inquiry. It involves an observation of the experience. And so it helps to disassociate from feelings and helps you to become an observer of what's actually happened. And secondly, it involves rational thought. That engages a different part of the brain, which helps to control the stress response. And of course, making a habit of calibrating your feelings provides an early warning indicator in the event that your anxiety levels are increasing. So the sooner you realize this is happening, the earlier you can intervene and the easier it then is to get those feelings under control. So this is a representation of how you might calibrate your feelings against the various impact areas and having identified the various components that might be in play. And you don't need to do anything quite this formal. This is just a way to represent it. But actually, if you were working with somebody else to support them, actually having a way to visually represent the level of distress and calibrate it against the various impact areas can be very, very helpful. And working in this way will help. It takes you through the identify, the validate, the calibrate steps of the support process. And then the question then, of course, is what can we do to help now we know what we're dealing with? And the first thing is to recognize that there's unlikely to be one single silver bullet that's going to fix all the issues that might have been identified. It's far more likely that they're going to have to be addressed individually and in turn. However, what can happen is that by addressing one of the issues, the attitudes, the thoughts, and the feelings we have around the other issues are changed. And so there can be a positive consequential impact from simply addressing that first most significant issue. What we're really trying to do is to remove and let fall away each of those issues that's causing us difficulty, to restore good health and allow ourselves to recover. So we've got a good idea now of what makes up our distress and how those things are impacting on life and the calibration of those. So what can we do to reduce or eliminate those impacts? And I'm just going to take you through now a number of strategies that have been shown to be helpful, and I've experienced them as helpful. Now you might find one of these works particularly well for you, or it might be that you employ a number of different strategies for different situations. The main thing is to find what works for you. As I said at the start, we're all unique. There's no one size fits all. That will solve the answers we face in life. Let's have a little look at some of the things that we can do. First one, to reiterate, is calibrate. As I've just said, calibration can be really helpful. It can be a therapeutic thing to do in its own right because it provides that perspective that can otherwise be missing. And seeing our feelings in perspective will often help us realize actually they're not quite as difficult to cope with as we might otherwise have thought. And I worked with a lady just the other week who found exactly that. Secondly, a question, past, present, or future. Consider again the idea that anxiety is future-based. Are you aware of how much of your life you spend effectively living in the future? If you were to draw a pie chart of where you live in your head, how big would the segments be for past, present, and future? And just consider that for a moment. Typically, the past and the future segments are far and away the biggest, and the present moment segment is tiny. because we allow ourselves to get caught up in thoughts and we lose the present moment. So becoming aware of where you are in time enables you to consciously and deliberately bring yourself back to the present moment. And when you do that, a great question to ask yourself is, right here, right now, is there a problem? Where right here is this moment, not today, not this morning, not this hour, but this moment. And 99.9% of the time, you're going to find the answer to that question is no, there is not a problem. And yet we create suffering and distress for ourselves, which we experience as real, but it's based upon something that has not yet happened. So recognizing that there isn't a problem right now can be a really helpful way to anchor ourselves in the reality of the present. Thirdly, and closely aligned to that, is get mindful. Closely aligned to the practice of mindfulness, it's been shown to be highly effective in treating stress, anxiety, and low mood. It's been shown to change the way the brain reacts and responds to situations. And it's really the practice of present moment awareness, of learning to sit with whatever we're experiencing, whatever we're thinking or feeling at any moment, without judgment, and just bringing our attention to all sensations. And because mindfulness is to do with the present moment, it just helps us to reduce our anxiety. Next up, and mindfulness is quite a relaxing activity, is relax. And that sounds very simple. But when we're anxious, we trigger a stress or threat response. Essentially, our mind puts the body on high alert for danger, and we prepare to do one of three things. We prepare to fight, we prepare to run away, or we prepare to freeze and play dead to avoid being of interest to a predator. So during those periods, we're not thinking particularly rationally, because actually we don't need to. We simply need to survive. And the fight-flight response is primarily an emotional survival response, not a rational one. So a way to counter that is to relax. When we relax, we reduce the release of the stress hormones and we activate release of the feel-good hormones, dopamine and serotonin. Relaxation is part of the body's inbuilt balancing mechanism. And it helps us to think more rationally about the situation we're in. And relaxation is a skill that we can develop. With practice and through the use of a range of techniques, mindfulness, meditation, breathing techniques can all help us. So relaxation is very, very useful. Next up is observe your thoughts. Another way to reduce our anxiety is to work with the thoughts that we're having, becoming aware of the thoughts and investigating how we react to them. There's a very close link between our thoughts, the physical sensations we experience, our emotional responses, and our behavior. The link is so close that most of the time we don't even realize it's there. We experience what we think is a single thing, often distress. But when we look closely, what we see are these four things in play. And we can work with them to change our reactions to situations. One of the easiest things to work with is thoughts. And if we change the way we think about a situation, we can change the sensations, emotions, and behavior as well. Our thoughts are often a stimulus for our other reactions. And the psychologist Viktor Frankl said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in the space lies choice. And when we start to become consciously aware of our thoughts, sensations, emotions, and behavior, we're opening up that space between stimulus and response and giving ourselves time to choose what we want to do. And one of the things we can choose to do is to accept. We should remember that when we're uncomfortable in any situation, that discomfort actually stems from us wanting the situation to be different than it is. You know, often we can't change the situation. We can't make COVID not exist. We can't directly change the restrictions we've all been living under. What we can do is recognize our discomfort and accept it as valid. We can also make choices about how we're going to deal with the situation. As the Roman philosopher Seneca said, man is affected not by events, but by the view he takes of them. And to quote Frankl again, He wrote in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. So when we accept our situation, we immediately lessen its negative impact. Then we can face our fears. One thing that often happens when we're faced with an anxiety-inducing situation is that we seek to avoid it. We get a quick fix. We turn away from it and we get a quick fix. We no longer feel the anxiety or distress. But what we do then is we unwittingly strengthen that underlying fear. We make it bigger and more powerful. And I've seen that a lot as a result of the pandemic, where people have been shielding, staying at home, avoiding going out, and they're now finding the idea of venturing back outside very daunting. So far from avoiding such fears, we need to turn and face them head on. If we're anxious about going back out into the world, we need to acknowledge that fear is real and then face it by moving out of our comfort zone and beginning to do things that actually make us uncomfortable. And we need to do that in a gradual way. We don't want to rush out into a massive crowd of people or go to a nightclub if we're worried about going out. We need to do it gradually, but if we approach the change in a gradual way and progressively expose ourselves to more and more uncomfortable things, actually we'll relatively quickly learn that we can build up our ability to cope with our resilience. Next, I would say write it down. You know, writing things down, writing down thoughts and feelings can be really beneficial. I've seen this with some of the people I've worked with. The value here, I think, is partly because you write something down, you get thoughts out of your head and you change the perspective on them. And I think we benefit from that change of perspective. We become objective observers. We experience our thoughts differently. We break the automatic thought, feeling, emotion, behavior cycle, and we give ourselves the opportunity to consider how we want to respond. So writing things down can be very useful. The last couple of things here, you know, one, get outside. There's a lot of evidence, and this is talked about a lot, but getting outside, getting into nature, has really beneficial effects on mood. So whenever possible, spending time outside and experiencing nature is something we can all benefit from. It's soothing, it's relaxing thing to do, and that can give us time and space to recharge and to rebuild our reserves of mental and emotional energy. And finally, I would say, ask for help. You know, anxiety is a fact of life. It can be helpful to us, but it can also be very difficult. And don't be afraid to reach out to family, friends, colleagues, or professionals for help if you get to a stage where you can't cope alone. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not weak. It's not wrong. It's actually a strong thing to do. So those are the coping strategies I would suggest. I've used them all, talked to people about them all in some form or other, and found them helpful in different guises. Remember, anxiety is a fact of life. It can be helpful. We don't want to eliminate it. We just need to develop our ability to understand it, realize where it's coming from, calibrate its impact on life, and then apply some fairly simple strategies that enable us to manage it, keep it at a level where it might be useful, and avoid it becoming overwhelming and then debilitating. And so that's the end of my particular presentation. I hope that's been helpful. I hope it's been useful. And if there are questions to answer, then I'll very gladly answer them now.
Hello, Andy, thank you very much for that. That was really interesting and really useful. We do have a few questions that have come in. And the first one is around going back to the workplace. It's been a huge subject, you know, in the news, and people have been talking about it. So we have a question around many companies considering a hybrid working strategy after lockdown, and you know, a split between home working and some time in the office. Do you see this as being largely beneficial to the workforce, or do you think people will fall into the trap of feeling connected to work more than ever?
That's a really good question, isn't it? I think, I think hybrid working, and I think that's absolutely right. I'd be really surprised if we didn't end up with a lot of hybrid working coming out of this. Now, hopefully, hybrid working will arise out of a consultation with people. They say, what works best for you as an individual? Where as an organization, we have a range of options, like a menu. You can work in the office, or you can work from home, or you can do a mix of the two things. I think in that case, really beneficial, because actually we're starting to tailor work to the individual. Instead of a one size fits all, everybody come to the office 9 till 5, Monday to Friday, and that's the way it is. So I think in those cases it can be hugely beneficial. I think there are some potential downsides to it. I think we get used to routines and ways in which life works. And if we think about things like team dynamics, for instance, it is possible that we end up with teams that don't always come together in the same shape. So one day there are a group of people working together in an office, and some people are at home, and then another day that might be a different group of people. And in a way, I suppose the danger that I could see is that every day we go in, we have to run through a resetting of our team dynamic. And it could take a while for that to become comfortable, normal. I don't know. I think it's early days. I think it's going to be very interesting.
Definitely. We do have another question sort of around that same theme, where someone's asked their partner can't have the vaccine for health reasons, and they're expected to return to the office full time. And this person knows that some of their colleagues aren't as COVID safe as they've been, and it makes them feel resentful about going back to that rhythm of being in the office. How can I stop this from affecting me so much is the question.
Well, that's a really kind of individual question, isn't it? And I've worked with one or two people over the course of the pandemic in the health sector who've been faced with similar dilemmas. And actually, I suppose this takes us into the area of the moral, ethical impact and the idea of a moral injury. I've got somebody who cannot be vaccinated. Therefore there is an element of risk in that, and I'm working with people who don't appear to be COVID safe, but I'm being told they have to go back. But the question is whether you can do anything about that. If you can't change it, then we get to the point of accept. So accepting, creating inner distress by fighting against something you can't change is just going to make the situation worse. So accepting the situation for what it is, and it will help to lessen that and enable you to look at it rationally. The thing I would always say to people is, the same way you can calibrate distress and anxiety, you can calibrate risk. So the calibration of risk is, in this space, I think, quite helpful. Where's your risk level at any moment in time? So you're in a workplace. Now, if you're the only one there, the risk level is probably incredibly low. If 20 people come in and they haven't been isolating and they've been careless, the risk level is going to go up dramatically. So you have to choose then what you do with that. How do you engage with it? How do you start to keep yourself safe? It's a very tricky one. I think you have to take it up with your employer to some degree, and maybe we all have to become a bit braver at calling out the people who aren't behaving in a responsible way, because we need to respect that. Some of us are vaccinated. Unfortunately, some are not yet vaccinated. That situation is going to be around for a long time, and we are not yet out of the pandemic. And I think that we shouldn't be afraid, should we, to say to other people, the way you're behaving is not right. It's not appropriate. And I without talking out of turn, because I don't know the employers, I think most employers that I know would take that pretty seriously. They have a duty of care to their people, and they would respond in a supportive way to the idea that people are being exposed to unacceptable levels of risk.
Well, we really hope so. Yeah, it sounds like a supportive employer would be needed there, and we hope that most will be.
At an individual level, acceptance and calibration I think, are probably the things that I would say focus on.
That's great. We have just a couple of minutes for another. I'm going to try and amalgamate them a little bit. We have a few questions around boundaries and an unpopular opinion of the home working has been quite good in terms of having an excuse, if you like, for drawing boundaries in terms of work, in terms of social interactions, because you have a good reason for it. And now that's slowly being taken away. And apart from working on boundaries is an ongoing, of course, process. But what would your advice be in terms of starting to perhaps think about, the situation is changing and I need to be more perhaps assertive in saying what I am and I'm not comfortable with?
Well, firstly, think about the language. So that thought that you're doing there, that you've just articulated there, is that that ability for me to draw my boundaries is being taken away. Think about the language of that. Something is being taken away from me. It's powerless language, and it's not true. That boundary setting can only be removed if you allow it to be removed. And so part of it is the thought. It's that thought that it is being taken away from me, and the answer is it isn't. You still have the same ability that you've always had to say no, thanks very much. I won't go to that. And that's really important, because so many of the people I've worked with effectively give away their power, and they become helpless when they're not really helpless at all. It's just that the thoughts they're having about the situation are leading to a sense of helplessness. So, actually, we could see the last 14 months as an opportunity almost to reset the bar on our boundaries. And we're under no obligation to go back to the way it was before. And if anything, I think it might be easier to maintain boundaries in that sense as we move forward. As long as we just keep hold of that thought that we're entitled to do that, there's nothing wrong with it. We don't need an excuse. If I don't want to socialise, I can just say no, thank you. I don't need to feel bad about that. It's nothing wrong with it, and we shouldn't tell ourselves there's something. Now, the flip side to that is where there's a bit of soul searching required, is because that desire to set boundaries, and particularly at this juncture, could be an indicator of avoidance, where I'm actually avoiding re-engaging with the world, and the setting of boundaries is an easy way to do that. Now, I would say, and the reason it's soul searching is because you have to be honest with yourself about why you want to do it. And if it's because you're scared of going back out into the world, completely understandable given what we've been through. Actually, then setting the boundaries and keeping the fortress built is probably the wrong thing to do. I have worked with people through the last 40 months who had got to a stage where simply going out of the front door was a problem, and we don't want to get to that.
No, that makes sense completely. Well, there we have it. It's qualified and official permission for all of us to say no to things we don't feel like are useful to us. Absolutely. That's brilliant. That is all the time we have for questions today. Thank you again very much for that wonderful presentation. It was so interesting. We hope that all of our attendees today found it really good too. Thank you for coming today. We really appreciate your time. So before you go, we are always looking at ways we can expand and improve our support. So when the little survey pops up in a couple of seconds, please do take a minute to fill that in and tell us what else we could do to support you better. But in the meantime, don't forget to check out our Wellbeing Hub and have a wonderful rest of the day. See you next time.